Greetings. I bid you welcome to the 31 Nights of Frights. I apologise massively for that awful Bela Lugosi impression. So in the last episode we took a look at the most famous horror film from the silent era, which was also the first feature-length vampire movie, Nosferatu, from 1922. And although Nosferatu was the first film adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, the movie was not legally authorised to be made by Bram Stoker's estate, and that ultimately led to a lawsuit which resulted in the courts ordering that every copy of that film should be completely destroyed, which obviously they failed at doing. However, 9 years later in 1931, Universal Pictures would release the film that would start a whole new era in horror history, and it would also be the first official film adaptation of Bram Stoker's classic novel. The film in question is Tod Browning's Dracula. I did the Dracula voice again, I can't help it, okay? It's like infectious. 92 years after its release, and this film is still regarded as one of, if not the best, Dracula movie. It set a whole new standard for the horror genre at the time, it brought horror into the golden age of cinema, and it's still the movie that most people think of first whenever they talk about Dracula, which is actually extremely impressive considering just how many movie adaptations have been made of Bram Stoker's novel within the past century. At the end of the 1920s, Hollywood and cinema in general was evolving, and in 1927 the whole cinematic landscape would be changed forever with the release of the movie The Jazz Singer. For those of you who don't know, The Jazz Singer was the first movie to actually feature spoken dialogue, or as they called those movies at the time, a talkie. And this effectively just killed off the entire silent movie era. But believe it or not, at the time, people were extremely skeptical of these talking pictures, and a lot of them thought that it was just a fad that would have no longevity and just die off after a couple of years. That's a pretty crazy thing to think about now, and yeah, hindsight is a funny thing. Of course, it was only a matter of time before the first talkie horror movie would be made. And does anyone want to take a guess at what film that was? Well, it was Dracula. In addition to bringing horror into a whole new era of cinema, and also due to Dracula's commercial and critical success, the movie was also responsible with fully kicking off the whole Universal Monsters movie series. As I mentioned at the end of my Nosferatu review, German cinematographer Karl Freund, who worked on many famous German expressionist films during the 20s, including Metropolis and The Golem, was actually hired to work on Dracula. And for me, that's the important connection and bridge between the German silent horror films and the new era of horror films in the Hollywood Golden Age. I do fully believe that this was an important element of the development of future horror movies, as Dracula clearly has that expressionism DNA built within it. The movie itself is beautifully lit with the exaggerated lighting and shadows that we saw in the earlier German horror films, and it also features these larger-than-life sets designed for the movie, which still to this day look absolutely phenomenal. I mean, talk about world building and creating an atmosphere. I can't even really begin to put into words how spectacular the sets are. I really think they just speak for themselves. In fact, these sets were so huge and expensive to build that Universal Studios actually kept them standing and used them for many future productions. Now that is money well spent. A fun fact is that the Royal Albert Hall sequence in the film was filmed on the Opera House set built for 1925's The Phantom of the Opera. This set was built on Soundstage 28 of the Universal backlot, and it stood for 90 years before being disgracefully demolished in 2014. The incredible gothic structures and dramatic lighting of Dracula definitely set a new standard for movies to come, and once again, the inspiration and evolution of the sets from the Expressionist era are clear to see. I think this is definitely most apparent with the Carfax Abbey set. The winding staircase just reminds me of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This is also something that we'll see in the next Universal Monsters film, Frankenstein, but we're going to get to that one next. Speaking of 𝙁𝙁𝙎𝙬, apparently the production of Dracula was actually a big disorganized mess, and a lot of the time Tod Browning would actually leave Frowned in charge of the whole production. So technically this film was directed as much by 𝙁𝙁𝙎𝙬 as it was by Tod Browning. However, I am glad that this is the case because some of 𝙁𝙁𝙎𝙬's photography work on this film has resulted in some truly beautiful and iconic shots. Something else that I really love about this movie is its incredible atmosphere. Now, a lot of Dracula's chilling atmosphere is thanks to those incredible gothic sets that we just talked about. But also, while watching the film, you may notice that there is no music in it at all. The only time we actually hear music in the film is in the opening credits, which features music from Act 2 of the ballet Swan Lake, and a scene that takes place at the Royal Albert Hall. As it turns out, with sound being such a new innovation within films, filmmakers actually believed that the audience wouldn't accept hearing music within a film if there's no explanation for the music being there. That's something that's pretty funny to think about today, but it makes complete sense for the time. In fact, this absence of music actually gives the film this kind of stage play sort of quality to it. And this actually makes sense because the film itself is actually based on the 1927 play adaptation of the book. This also explains why the film is not 100% faithful to the plot of Bram Stoker's novel, but let's be honest, it never was going to be anyway. The Broadway production for Dracula ran for over 260 performances and starred Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi in the titular role, a man who would make a permanent bite mark on horror history and Dracula as a character. But that almost wasn't the case. The role of Dracula was actually intended to go to actor Conrad Veidt, who played Caesar in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Well, how about that? Another connection tracing back to the Expressionist era. However, Veidt returned to Germany fearing that his English was not good enough for the talkies. Universal then turned to the legendary man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney, who previously portrayed the Phantom of the Opera in the 1925 film. However, Lon Chaney sadly passed away in August of 1930. In fact, studio executives considered many actors for the role before Bela Lugosi actually landed it. And even then, Lugosi had to fight hard to convince the studio to actually cast him in the role. And he had to accept a pay of just $500 a week. That was a total of $3,500 for the entire movie. Even at the height of the American Great Depression that was going on at the time, that was a pretty shitty pay. Just imagine how different cinema history and pop culture history would have been if Lugosi did not get that role. I certainly believe that it was a case of something that was just meant to be. And by far the standout aspect of this movie is Lugosi, or Lugosi. That's apparently the correct way of pronouncing his Hungarian last name, but everyone calls him Bela Lugosi, so I'm just not going to confuse things and carry on calling him Bela Lugosi. His performance of Count Dracula literally changed the way that character would be viewed forever. When people think of Dracula, they see and hear Lugosi. In Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula is described as an aging man with a mustache who gets younger as the book goes along as he feasts on his victims. Only a few of the many film adaptations of Stoker's novel have actually done this, and to my knowledge, only one actually features the detail of Dracula having a mustache. But this is directly because of how culturally impactful Bela Lugosi's performance was. Although Bela Lugosi's image set the standard for Dracula and is absolutely iconic, the same can also be said for his voice. Lugosi was Hungarian born, and with English being his second language, this resulted in his line delivery having a certain strange rhythm to it. His accent and manner of speaking forever became the voice associated with Dracula. Whenever anyone does a Dracula impression, they're doing a Lugosi. On top of this, Dracula is an absolute lady killer, quite literally, in this movie. This is definitely the start of Dracula becoming somewhat of a sex symbol and romanticised for sure. But nothing about Lugosi's performance as Dracula is anything less than iconic. From his elegant yet intimidating presence to the way he moves his cape around and that death-like glare he gives you that just lets you know that you're absolutely f***ed. Lugosi balances playing the charming aristocrat and the animal-like vampire perfectly. I absolutely love the scene when he slaps the mirror out of Van Helsing's hand. Look at his face, Dracula is absolutely pissed. It's actually these close-up shots of Dracula that may be my favourite in the entire film. I adore the way Karl Freund lights Lugosi's eyes in these shots, and another thing to note is that Lugosi actually never blinks in this film. Super minimalistic acting performed by a legend. Keep in mind that this was exactly 60 years before Anthony Hopkins did the same thing when portraying Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, a role that would win him an Oscar. A trivia fact that is pretty well known, especially amongst horror fans, but is absolutely awesome, is that when Bela Lugosi passed away in 1956, he was actually buried in a Dracula cape. That is legendary. Another noteworthy performance from this film that I have to mention is Dwight Fry in his performance as the psychotic and schizophrenic Renfield. Fry does an incredible job at playing this crazed character, and you can clearly see just how much fun he's having with it. His laugh is so maniacal that I actually found myself laughing along with him. The scene where Renfield talks about Dracula promising to give him thousands of rats to feed on, yeah, weird, is one of the standout moments from the entire film.
Rats, 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 thousands, millions of them.
And it made me realise that Dwight Fry would actually be the perfect casting choice to portray like a comic book Joker. This man was way ahead of his time. Of course Lugosi steals the show, but Fry certainly should not be forgotten. Naturally, because of the era this film was made in, there isn't much to see in terms of graphic violence or anything like that. The film was made a few years before the introduction of the Hays Code, a set of motion picture rules and guidelines that prohibited profanity, suggestive nudity, and graphic violence to be depicted in a film. Basically the fun stuff, right? So there's no blood in this film, or certainly anything close to a gory sequence. But something that I thought was somewhat strange but interesting is that not only do we not see the bite marks on Dracula's victims, they're talked about in the scene and they're pointed out, but there's never a close-up or any actual visible shot of bite marks, but we don't actually see Dracula's fangs altogether. And there's plenty of scenes where Dracula goes to attack one of his victims, but not once do we see those iconic fangs. Again, I still think Caligari was literally decades ahead of its time with its murder sequence. Of course, I'm talking about the scene that implies a brutal stabbing by using shadows. Remember, that was 1920, 40 years before Hitchcock did something similar with Psycho. Another well-known thing about this film that I thought I should quickly mention is that there's actually two versions of this 1931 Dracula film. The English version with Bela Lugosi, which is obviously the one we're talking about right now, and a Spanish version of the film. As it turns out, back then it was commonplace to shoot the same movie twice with different actors for audiences who speak different languages. So throughout the day they would shoot the English version of the film, and then by night they would shoot the Spanish speaking version of the film. I've got to admit, I have not seen the Spanish speaking version of Dracula, but I've heard really great things about it. Some people even go as far as saying it's better than the English version because the filmmakers could see what they were doing with the Lugosi version and then at night time replicate that or do it better. Overall, Dracula is another film of cinematic firsts. The movie paved the way for the whole golden era of Hollywood horror movies, as well as the entire Universal Monsters line of films. This movie set a new standard for horror and made such a big cultural impact that 90 years later, this is still the Dracula film that people see in their minds when they think about the character. Although the film isn't the most faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel, with the odd plot change here and there, it's still, and always will be, one of the best. So join me in the next episode where we take a look at our next Universal monster and the next horror icon from the golden era. I'll see you there.